Hello party people, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tori. Today's video is going to be all about books. I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read this summer from like May to Labor Day, because that's what I consider to be the end of summer. I have a pretty good mix of classics. I have a couple books that I feel like are not being talked about, and then I have a couple books that are super popular on Book Talk and BookTube right now. So I thought I would just insert myself into the conversation. I'm really excited that I'm like kind of on a reading kick right now. I know it was like hot girl reading summer, but I also think because my job is very much online, I like to have a nice break from the internet, from screens, so I've kind of been using books as that escape. Also just wanted to say that if you are someone who wants to expand their personal library, I definitely recommend shopping online for books. Similar to how I shop for my own clothing, I love to shop secondhand and support small businesses when I'm buying books. I like to go on eBay if I'm looking for like a specific like cover of a book. I love to look on thriftbook.com, and then if I want a new release or just want a new edition of a book, I'll shop on bookshop.org. This video is not sponsored by bookshop.org, but they recently gave me an affiliate code shop situation, so I'll throw that up on the screen. But if you wanted to support me and smaller bookshops, you can shop through my affiliate shop on bookshop.org. So if you live somewhere where there are not very many indie booksellers, or you just know that the indie booksellers around you just don't have that wide of a selection, I would definitely recommend bookshop.org. I definitely love these sites because they are a great alternative to shopping at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. So the first book I want to talk about is Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. This book is a memoir. It's written by Dolly Alderton, who is an award-winning British writer. So as you can kind of tell by the cover, she talks about a lot of things. She talks about parties, she talks about dating, she talks about life and growing up, but like growing up and the anxieties of, you know, coming into oneself. And then she also talks a lot about love in the platonic sense and also in the romantic sense. There were some stories and some excerpts in here that really were kind of weak and kind of brought down the collection as a whole for me, but otherwise I loved this. I read this so quickly. Dolly Alderton is so funny, and she kind of reminds me of like your one crazy friend who has really like interesting sex stories. I'm in my mid-20s. I felt like I really related to some of the stories that Dolly had to share, even though she grows up in the UK and London and I'm here in California. And then the second book I read is Exciting Times by naoise Dolan. I heard about this book because a lot of people on BookTube and Book Talk kind of compare naoise Dolan to Sally Rooney. But I don't like to compare women to one another because I feel like that's super reductive, but naoise Dolan and Sally Rooney definitely have things in common. So this book follows Ava, who is an English second language teacher from Dublin living in Hong Kong. Throughout the book she has two lovers, Julian and Edith, and the book is separated into three parts. So the first part of the book is called Julian, and it focuses on Ava's relationship with Julian, who is this British banker. And then the second part of the book is called Edith, and Edith is a Hong Kong born lawyer, and these two have a relationship once Julian has to go back to London for a job. And then the third part is Edith and Julian. So this book talks a lot about different things like class, queer identity, and the power dynamics within relationships and the power dynamics within intimacy that exist. And in this book, Ava is not as wealthy as Julian or Edith, so there are a lot of talks about power dynamics of wealth within their social friend groups. And I just loved that naoise Dolan, through Ava, goes light on how the way we speak can affect the way people perceive our intelligence and our class and our social standing and other things like that. One thing I did not really understand about this book is why it was set in Hong Kong. I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that like Hong Kong has like British influence, as does Ireland, but I feel like overall the city itself did not really lend itself to these big conversations. If anything, I kind of felt a bit like she was trying to make this story seem more exotic, and I mean that in a derogatory way, by setting it in Hong Kong. That was Exciting Times by naoise Dolan. The third book I read was People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. This is actually the second romance I've ever read, and this was the first romance that I read that had a friends to lovers trope. This book centers around two characters, Poppy and Alex. Poppy is like this very eccentric, quirky, very outgoing girl, and then Alex is a more reserved and quiet man. Every year since they met their freshman year of college, they've gone on an annual trip together. That is until 2 years ago when something dramatic happened. In this book, it starts and Poppy has not spoken to Alex in 2 years, and she kind of feels like lost and like directionless in her life, and she has a feeling that if she just rekindles her friendship with Alex, things will start to make sense and things will fall into place. So he actually agrees to go on a vacation with her, and they kind of repair their friendship. The way this story is told is also told in like different timelines, so it'll flip-flop. So it'll start like this summer and then flash back to the first summer they had together, and then come back to the present and then move on to the second summer they spent together. It was really just a really quick read. I definitely want to read Beach Read by Emily Henry because I just really enjoyed this. This was really fun, and I also feel like whenever I read really fun books like this, my brain doesn't even put in the brain power to like visualize new characters. I literally just pictured Lily Collins as Poppy and Sam Claflin as Alex for this book, and it also helped me, I think, get out of a reading slump. So the fourth book I read this summer is one that I've not seen talked about too often, and that is American Son by Brian Ascalon Roley. This book was published in like 2001. I picked up this book because my cousin Olivia recommended it. I tried to make it a point this year to read more Asian American centered stories. So this book follows two brothers named Gabe and Tomas and their mom in South Santa Monica in 1993. And the story is told in Gabe's point of view. So Gabe is the younger brother out of the two, and he's the more quiet and reserved one. He's the one that's more in tune to the emotions of his mother and the people all around him. And then there's Tomas, his older brother, who is more of the stereotypical masculine man, and Tomas actually breeds like attack dogs for a living, and within this he also pretends to be Mexican rather than Filipino American. This story is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is just kind of establishing their normal life. The second part of the book takes place when Gabe runs away. That's not a spoiler because it's literally on the back of this book. And the third part takes place after Tomas runs away and the consequences of his actions. It was published in 2001, so I would definitely say that there is a bit of dated language in here. So if you kind of just like go into this book with that mindset, I think you'll be okay. I will say though, part 2, when Gabe runs away, I was getting a slight like, not PTSD, but like the situation that he was in was very similar to A Little Life and something traumatic that happens in A Little Life. And I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Is this about to happen? Is something about to happen? It didn't, but I got scared. So now I think that I definitely am suffering consequences of reading A Little Life. Back to this story. I feel like this book follows the structure that most classic books take when they talk about the West and talk about California. And what I mean by that is that not much happens in this story, and the consequences of Gabe's actions don't necessarily culminate into one like dramatic moment. Instead, you kind of see the way it affects him internally, it affects his relationships with his mom and his brother, and just the way that it changes him in slight ways. So if you're looking for something that's super action-packed and like everything has like meaning, everything has consequence, you won't get that from this book. So yes. The next book I read, I actually don't have a physical copy of because my friend Emma lent it to me, but it was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. So this book takes place in 1969 North Carolina in like the marshes, Outer Banks-esque area. It's told in 2 timelines, back and forth. I believe the first timeline is like 1969, so like the present day, and it follows the murder investigation of Chase Andrews, who's like the golden child of this really small town in North Carolina. The second timeline describes the childhood and the growth of Kaya, who is this young girl living by herself in the marshes and who eventually becomes the marsh girl that everyone in the town talks about, and she ends up being the prime suspect in Chase's murder. Honestly, I really just wanted to read this book because I know there's a movie coming out with Easy Edgar Jones from Hulu's adaptation of Normal People, so I was like, you know what, she was phenomenal in that. I can't wait to see her act in this next project. It was really good and I'm happy I read it, but its first 100 pages kind of dragged on for me because I was like, okay, the descriptions of the marsh, I get it. Like, I'm more of someone who likes to be in the mind of the character. But as Kaya's timeline got closer to the murder investigation timeline, I was like, okay, you got me. I'm locked and loaded. I'm invested in this story. So speaking of the 1960s, the next book that I read was Zoday's Fast Company by Eve Babitz. This is another one of the books that I mentioned in my last book video. This is kind of what Eve Babitz is known for. She's really known for her like semi-fictional autobiographical short stories, and I enjoyed this collection so much. For those of you who don't know, Eve Babitz was very much a fixture in the social scene from the 1960s, honestly, to like the 1990s. Her godfather was Igor Stravinsky, who was the Russian composer. Her sister was the one who created the leather trouser that Jim Morrison from The Doors ended up wearing and kind of making his signature. And Eve is also like an amazing woman. Not only was she like in these social scenes, but there's also a very famous photograph of her playing chess with Marcel Duchamp. She is naked. It's honestly iconic. Before each short story in this collection, there is a transcript of very real notes that Eve left for her partner at the time, who was reading this book when it was still in its manuscript form. So that's what makes it kind of fictional, but also like adds an element of Eve's real life into it. I honestly thought this book was hilarious. Like, there were so many tidbits that she shared that were so small, but that felt so deeply personal to me as someone who grew up here. Some of my favorite short stories from this collection are Dodger Stadium, Sirocco, Bad Day at Palm Springs. I don't know, I really liked this, and I feel like this is definitely a short read, and it definitely helped me not only reach a reading goal, but also just like get back into it again. And if you really liked Taylor Jenkins Reid's book, Daisy Jones and the Six, you'll also love this. She talks a lot about different iconic places in LA and partying at the chateau and eating dinner at Musso and Frank's, so would definitely recommend if you loved that book. We are literally continuing on with the 1960s California of it all, and so the next book that I read was Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. I mentioned in my last book video that a lot of the time Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays and So Days Fast Company by Eve Babitz often get compared to one another. Joan Didion and Eve Babitz are kind of literary foils in the sense that they both talk about California and Los Angeles, but they both have different sentimental ties. Like American Sun and like so many other classic contemporary novels about California, not much happens in this book, but it's like the beauty of the prose that really locks you in. I'm really just a Joan Didion fangirl. If you also want to check out Joan Didion, I would recommend this one or her collection of essays, The White Album. This book follows 31-year-old Mariah. This book kind of oscillates between two moments in her life. The first is like her present moment where her career is slowing down and her personal relationships are kind of crumbling. And the second is her reflections on her childhood and growing up in Silver Wells, Nevada. I would definitely recommend you look up the trigger warnings to this book if you are interested in reading it, because it does talk about suicide and a few more potentially triggering topics. I think it's definitely really a fun read if you're into kind of getting more into the culture of Los Angeles and California, because we do have a culture here. This was a good one. I will continue to read anything Joan Didion makes. And I recently just purchased Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, so I'm definitely on a Didion kick right now. The next book that I read in the summer was The Lightness by Emily Temple. This was a read that I just picked up on a whim because I thought the cover was really stunning, and because the praise for this kind of compared Emily Temple's work to Ottessa Moshfegh and Emma Cline, two authors that I really love. Our protagonist Olivia tells us the story of when she went to the Levitating Center, which is this meditation center high in the mountains, and it also happens to be the place where her father was last seen before he disappeared. So she goes to this camp to kind of connect with her father again and kind of find clues to his disappearance. But while she's there at this summer camp, Olivia becomes infatuated with this trio of girls, and most notably their leader named Serena. I loved the prose in this book. I thought it was phenomenal, and I think this book also accurately captures the teenage girl experience. And I feel like there's so many parts of teenage girldom that are so complex and so overwhelming, and I think this book really accurately captures the teenage girl desire to be desired and the lengths that some individuals will take to feel that kind of high. And this book also kind of feels like the literary version of Mood Ring by Lorde. I'm just thinking about how in that song Lorde kind of makes a criticism about the way white women have kind of appropriated like Eastern culture when it comes to like alternative forms of medicine and alternative forms of meditation. Like Emily Temple, and I feel like she gets that too in the way that she talks about Olivia's father and his relationship with spirituality. I also really loved in these excerpts, I felt like I learned a lot about different religions. Like I feel like Emily Temple was very, like she studied up pretty well when she was talking about certain practices and talking about like certain cultures. Obviously it'd probably be better to go to the source, but especially in like a literary fiction context, I think she did such a great job, and this book was so good. So this next book is the 9th book that I read this summer, and it was honestly the most disappointing read, but also the quickest read of the summer. And that was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Did I finish this book in 3 days? Yes. Did I enjoy it? Not really. This is another one of those super popular book talk, booktube books, so I won't get too much into it. This book takes place in August 1983, and it follows the 4 Riva siblings, Nina, Jay, Hud, and Kit, when they throw their annual summer party. And by the end of the party, Nina's house is up in flames. And the 4 Riva siblings are the children of Mick Riva, who we all meet in The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This book also does a little bit of time hopping as well. Most of the book takes place from Nina's point of view, but there are also excerpts that take place from her mother June's point of view. It was doing a lot of telling but not doing a lot of showing, so I really did not like that aspect of the book. I also felt that once it came to the party scene, Taylor Jenkins Reid started to introduce way more characters, even though I'm sure she introduced these characters to kind of make the party seem more well-rounded and like just so we would know the kind of debauchery that was happening at this party. It really just confused the hell out of me, and then I was like, why are you going to introduce me to these characters that I'm only going to meet once? Like, I actually don't care. I feel like the way I could have connected to the characters better is just if they each told their own story. So I feel like Malibu Rising, while it was a really fun concept, definitely could have benefited from being written in a different format. If TJR wrote this book in an oral history like she did with Daisy Jones and the Six, I feel like this would have been way more enjoyable. So I don't even know if it's like the 10th book I read, but the 10th book I finished this summer was Dune by Frank Herbert. Did it take me 4 months to finish this book? Yes, but I finished it. I'm on the other side, and apparently I only had to read to the end of part 2 to be ready for the movie. So basically this book follows Paul Atreides and his family as they move to the desert planet of Arrakis for a stewardship. So on this desert planet, they harvest a spice called the melange, which gives people a lot of supernatural powers and is really integral to space travel and things like that within this universe. So control of this planet is very important. I'm happy I read it because it's a sci-fi classic. However, there are definitely parts of this where like I just need to become a better reader or have a better strategy when reading. When Frank Herbert would describe sand, I would lose it. I would go sleepy. Whenever like a lot of political strategy and espionage was talked about, sleep over my head, literally could not tell you anything. The main part of this book that I really loved was the internal monologue and strategy that Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, would implement whenever they would like talk to someone or like try and plan their strategy. Like I'm trying not to spoil this book, but like their internal monologues I thought were so interesting, and the history of like the peoples who lived on this planet and who are in this ecosystem of a universe I thought was super interesting. But I refuse to hear more about sand dunes. That's Dune. That's all I have to say. Kind of on the Timothée Chalamet is in a film adaptation of this book trend. The 11th book that I finished this summer was Call Me By Your Name by André aciman. So this book is very similar to the movie except for the ending. I kind of enjoyed this book, but I also kind of hated it. I think my one mistake was going into this book thinking it was a love story. I feel like this book perfectly captures the language of having an obsessive crush, a very obsessive one-sided love affair. I think if you go into the book with that mentality, you will get more out of it. I think there were some great points that André aciman makes through Elia when he talks about like the dichotomy of like fear and desire or like shame and intimacy. There are some points in this book when Elia is like kind of figuring out his identity and figuring out who he is, where it's like it's uncomfortable to read because you can tell it's hard for this character to experience it. The language used in this book was really beautiful. I felt like some passages of this book were also slightly repetitive, but again, I feel like that just goes back to like the way this book captures the language of obsession and the language of having like a really intense crush on someone. I feel like this book really talks a lot about longing and like the complicated relationship we all have to our own desires and whether we should fulfill them or not. So that's my thoughts on Call Me By Your Name. I don't think we need any more like cisgender female takes on this book, so I'm like so sorry if this is cringy to you. Also now I'm just gonna be thinking about like the linguistics of the word later. So later. We are on the last two books that I read this summer. So the 12th book that I finished this summer is Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. Amanda Montell wrote the really popular book Word Slip, but I have yet to read it. I was really interested in this, partly because of the beautiful cover, but because I also am interested in cults. I don't consider myself to be a true crime junkie, but there's something really interesting to me about cults. So that's one of my personal flaws. So Amanda Montell makes a point in this book that this is really focused on the way cults have affected American culture and society, and focuses on its impact and its history within America. So this book breaks down the linguistics of cults, why we're so attracted to them, and how characteristics of cults have kind of seeped into our vernacular and into different facets of our culture. And within this book, Amanda Montell debunks brainwashing, but she also introduces something really interesting, which is the concept of like Protestant capitalism, and how America's history with like Protestant beliefs have kind of allowed cult-ish behavior to prosper. I think the biggest misconception with this book is that Amanda Montell is comparing very violent cult like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate to things like Soul Cycle and multi-level marketing schemes. That's not what she's saying at all. What she's saying is there are a lot of similar linguistic characteristics. The book starts with the more violent cults, and then she goes into more of like the religious cults, and then finally she ends with more modern day examples of cult-ish language like Soul Cycle and Peloton, and more things we're comfortable seeing day to day. And then the last book that I finished this summer was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And this book centers around David, who is an American expatriate living in 1950s Paris. The story opens up with David in the south of France. He is in this home by himself, and he's reflecting on his childhood and then the time he spent with this man named Giovanni, and then like back to the present moment. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was beautiful. It's also a pretty quick read. Within this book, James Baldwin talks a lot about like social alienation and identity and masculinity and what it means to be a man. It definitely took a turn from what I thought it was going to be, but I'm really happy that I read this summer. I definitely want to read more James Baldwin in the future. But yes, that's it for this video. Please let me know what books you've read that you really enjoyed, that you think I would love to read. Please let me know if you've read any of these, and I'll see you all for my next one. Bye.